Hey, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Storage Trends 2024. We'll just give it another, just a few seconds before we do introductions, give folks a chance to get on and get situated and perhaps get their cup of coffee ready. With us today, we have Jeff Janukowicz from IDC, Brian Beeler, owner and editor-in-chief of storagereview.com, and myself. We'll do brief intros momentarily, but the Storage Trends is a annual webinar that we do with the SCSI Trade Association. And we like to include viewpoints from industry analysts such as Jeff Janukowicz, and also through the media, which is Brian is representing that view. And I will present things and present a viewpoint from an industry, industry standards or industry association view of things. So let's get this show rolling here. Maybe Jeff, you can do a quick introduction to yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cam. And again, my name is Jeff Janukowicz. I manage IDC's coverage around storage and memory. I've had the opportunity to be at IDC for a little bit more than 17 years or so now. And my primary area of focus is around SSDs. But again, IDC is a leading market research firm. We've got over 1,000 analysts worldwide, and we look at everything from enterprise infrastructure to PCs and mobile phones and the like. Again, happy to be here with you guys.
Thanks, Jeff. Brian?
Hey all, Brian Beeler here, publisher, owner of storagereview.com, as Cam said, and we love to see, touch, feel things. So we're actively testing all sorts of storage solutions, from drives to SANs and switching and AI and all the stuff that goes into that in this modern infrastructure world. Located in Cincinnati, Ohio. So surely some of you have seen our content at storagereview.com, but also make sure to check out the social media if you want the memes at Storage Review on Instagram, Facebook, and even TikTok, wherever you guys are. So check us out.
Thanks, Brian. Again, my name is Cameron Brett. I'm the chair of the STA Forum, the SCSI Trade Association. Back in May of 2023, the SCSI Trade Association joined SNIA to become a forum within the larger SNIA organization. I'm also an employee of Kioxia America, focused on corporate marketing and outbound communications.
Hey, Cam, right before you get to the legal notice there, we do have a question about recording and availability afterwards. Maybe you want to address that.
Sure. To that first question, this is being recorded and it will be available on Bright Talk after the webinar is over. Thanks for the reminder, Brian. So the SNIA legal notice, this is something that we present at every webinar. I'll just leave this up here for a moment. Okay, before we get into the trends, just a little bit of quick snapshot about SNIA. SNIA is a large community of over 200 organizations, including corporations, universities, startups, and individuals. A vast number of active contributing members from companies in the industry, as well as the participating organizations, and over 50,000 worldwide IT end users and professionals. So it's a very well-established, credible industry association, and defines a lot of standards and has organizations such as the STA and the SSD SIG to be the authority on storage. Okay, just a couple of housekeeping items here. There is a dialog box where you can ask questions. I see somebody was able to do that already. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, and if we're not able to get to all the questions, there will be a Q&A blog post available after that should address every open question. And the slides are available for download. I believe they're available now if you like at the SNIA Educational Library. And we will have a couple of polling questions so that we encourage audience participation and kind of get a pulse of what the audience and the industry is seeing and thinking. And without further ado, okay, the first trend, before we jump into this, we all know that, with COVID, there was a big buying spree where all the companies were doing well, and that led to an oversupply and reduced demand. So we had a big dip, and so it's been a rough couple of years for the IT industry as a whole, but storage in particular. And so we thought this kind of quick look at what's happening with the storage industry in 2024 and maybe a little bit beyond. Jeff Janukowicz is certainly an authority on this subject, and I'd like to take it away, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. And obviously, you can see our sort of our next slide and what's going to happen in 2024. Certainly an interesting topic. But like you said, maybe before we start to look forward, I think it's important maybe we take a little bit of a step back and think a little bit about where we've been, because really the last couple of years have been very, very interesting for the storage industry and very, very unique, right? We went through the pandemic, and that drove a lot of companies to accelerate their digital transformation initiatives. And that drove a lot of demand for storage. Then as that pandemic began to subside a little bit, we did see some macroeconomic challenges beginning to emerge. We saw some supply-demand imbalances across the supply chain beginning to impact the overall market. And as you can see here on this chart that I'm sharing with you, right, the overall demand for storage began to fall relatively rapidly as we went through 2023. And if you look back to some of the peak numbers back in the early part of 2022, the hard drive and SSD industry were really shipping in excess of $10 billion a quarter. And as you can see, as we went through 2023, that revenue fell by almost 2/3. So Cam's right? It was a very, very challenging period for the industry. But the good news here is that the industry is starting to bottom out, right? We saw some improvements in the demand in the fourth quarter. And we think a lot of those challenges that negatively impacted the market are beginning to ease just a bit, right? So some of those macro pressures are beginning to ease. We're seeing some of the inventory position at some of the customer bases improving a little bit. We're seeing some of the cloud optimization strategies that some of the large CSPs put in place beginning to abate themselves. So we are starting to see some improvements. And I think, as you can see here, we do expect to see the market beginning to rebound as we work our way through 2024. But one of the other things that I think is very interesting is if you look at this chart, you can see the dark blue portion, right? That represents the enterprise SSD market. And that was also very severely impacted as well. So not only did it experience some impact due to lower demand, we also saw pricing playing a very big factor. And Cam, if we can jump to the next slide. So as the market demand began to weaken a little bit, we saw pricing around flash really, get negatively impacted. And as you can see here, pricing for several quarters as we worked our way through 2023 went down by 40 to almost 50% from a year-over-year basis. Now, again, just like we're starting to see the demand picture beginning to improve just a bit, we are starting to see also the pricing environment beginning to stabilize and starting to improve as we work our way through 2024. So we think that that's obviously something good for the industry. Now, I'm just like everybody else, right? I love low prices. But one of the challenges through this downturn that we've seen, and Cam, we can move to the next slide, is that the cost reductions for the overall industry haven't necessarily kept pace with where the overall pricing environment was going. So when you really look at the overall flash business, we really went through a period through 2023 where the industry was operating at really well below its target of profitability levels. And that was a challenge, right? So that's one of the reasons we saw a lot of the industry participants lowering their supply or cutting their capital expenditures. Now, the good news moving forward here is as you can see in this chart, we do think that the industry is going to return to some profitability as we work our way through 2024. And that's something that we think is obviously very, very good for the industry. And it's not to say that low prices aren't obviously very attractive, but the health of the industry is something that we think over the long term is obviously going to be very important for the industry to continue to invest and continue to advance the overall technology. So when we move forward, and Cam, we can move to the next slide quickly, we do see the overall demand for storage, rebounding over the next several years, right? And I think as Cam noted, 2023 was a very challenging year. We're seeing the market rebounding a lot in 2024. But really, when we step back, the demand for storage continues to exist. And a lot of the long-term trends that we've talked about, really for several years at IDC, whether we're talking about, the amount of data that's being created and thus being stored, all those trends are really going to continue to exist and really drive the demand for storage, over the next several years. But also we're seeing the advent of new workloads like artificial intelligence, right? And here's something that, has been around for a while, but really has jumped into the limelight over the last several quarters or so, that we think is also going to be another key factor in terms of driving some of this rebound around storage over the next several years. So I'll turn it back to you, Cam.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks for the insight there. Since Jeff touched on AI, the next trend topic that we want to discuss here is going to be about AI as it relates to storage. But we do have a couple of quick polling questions, and the polling questions and selection, the multiple choice, so there's no wrong answer here. Please answer the polling question, and then we'll give that maybe about 15 seconds, and then there's actually one more follow on here. And I think that's probably pretty good. And so if we can get that next polling question teed up, do you feel confident that your storage infrastructure can support an AI ML platform or workload effectively? So we'll give that a few more seconds.
Cam, you're not going to sing while people enter in their answers?
We want people to stay on. Okay, we'll give folks just another couple of seconds, but while we're waiting for that, the polling questions to wrap up, I'd like to turn it over to Brian. And since he sees a lot of the products out in the market, how are AI and ML affecting storage needs? So Brian, what are you seeing out there?
A lot of confusion, to be honest. And I think it starts with the root of almost every product these days is being marketed with an AI twist. It's either capable of AI, can drive AI insights, or will make your AI faster, better. I mean, everything falls into one of those categories, for better or for worse. But this is the same thing that we've seen in past trends around digital transformation, as Jeff mentioned earlier, or analytics before that, which I guess was kind of AI light a few years ago, or 5G. I mean, these cycles happen. Fundamentally, though, AI, I think, is even more hard to wrap your mind around, because AI means 1,000 different things depending on who you are and where you are in the cycle. If you were at Supercompute last year in Denver, you see a lot of these college organizations, you see major research organizations that are leveraging GPUs and AI models to predict weather or other sort of grand things that are great for society and humanity at large. With the advent of the popularity of ChatGPT, though, organizations have seen, wow, this is an extremely powerful tool. How can we use this to mine our own data while also minding the security issues of using public AI models. And then it's reaches all the way down into the workstation, to the practitioner level, to the early development of models and training. So I think when you look at a topic like AI, it's just really hard to say AI is any one thing. It is not. It is possibly dozens or hundreds or more things. And when you think about the infrastructure required to support those initiatives, it's not one thing either. At the high end, most AI implementations are being held back by network. And so we've got to address that situation. And once we do, then what? Then does that open up the funnel for storage to become a more important part of that transaction? And I believe it does, especially with Gen 5 storage now that's pretty well coming to market. But even Gen 6 and 7 are on the roadmaps, and organizations need to be thinking about that as they plan forward. But all the way down to the desktop, then reliable or sufficient storage. In fact, we ran into this problem in a recent project we did around E1S SSDs. We shared them over 100 gig to a bunch of different workstations, that those workstations could have high-speed access to lots of data that natively they just don't have. And there's all sorts of attached RAID enclosures or whatever, but then you run into this whole data protection concern from the enterprise level. So I feel like I'm confusing the issue by trying to not being able to give you a simple answer to the question. But there's just so much to unpack, and storage performance is one, but certainly networking is another.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate the comments. Jeff, do you have any commentary that you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, and absolutely. I think as Brian mentioned, right, there is just a lot going on around AI. And it will certainly evolve a lot over time. But the one thing that at least I feel confident with, right, is that AI is certainly going to drive a lot of new investments across the enterprise, across data centers worldwide. And, when we really step back and when we talk to companies about, what they're doing, Brian obviously touched on that, but it's really about trying to find that right balance between compute, memory, storage, and that networking aspect. Because, if we really start to get to that place that I think people envision around AI sort of being everywhere and sort of ubiquitous across the overall ecosystem, we really need to see the infrastructure evolving. Right. And I think as we move into 2024, clearly we're certainly seeing some trends, at least on the compute side. We're obviously seeing a lot of investments on the GPU side. And in some ways, that's maybe crowding out a little bit of spending on storage. But, that investment in terms of compute is certainly driving, a new upcycle in terms of memory. We're seeing an awful lot of interest in HBM. And HBM is something that I think, a lot of end users are starting to hear a little bit more about in terms of what that means for the overall ecosystem. But as it relates to storage, when we step back, we think that what AI really kind of articulates is that the value of data is only going to continue to get more and more. What we've seen through a lot of our research is that the more complete the data set, the bigger the model size, right, the better outcomes that you're going to get out of your AI infrastructure, right? So over time, we do believe that that's going to help to drive a lot towards storage. But that impact may be a little bit more towards the latter years of some of our forecasting here. Now, if you look at this chart on the right-hand side, so myself and some of my colleagues, we did do a little bit of work looking at the implications in terms of the investment for semiconductors, as well as storage mechanisms in terms of hard drives and SSDs over time to support, this infrastructure that we think is going to be needed to put in place. And as you can see in this chart, right, there's going to need to be a lot of investment to be able to support this overall, push for AI everywhere. And it's something that we've started to look at least as part of some of our research here as well.
Hey, Jeff, I've got a question for you. The second poll says, is a question about confidence in your storage's infrastructure's ability to handle AI. And I think our audience is somewhat optimistic, in my view, at 58% thinking that they've got existing infrastructure, or maybe people have better storage infrastructure than we've been seeing out in the wild. You talked a little bit about capacity too, which is going to be an increasingly important part of this. But what's your take on that number? As an analyst, I'm sure you've seen a lot. I'm curious if you agree with me that perhaps this audience is overconfident in their infrastructure's abilities, or no?
Well, what's interesting, Brian, right, is that a lot of the existing AI implementations that we see today are really built on existing infrastructure, right? Not a lot has changed. But where I think where it starts to get interesting is that we will start to see over time that infrastructure evolving. And when people say AI, they kind of lump it all together. But obviously the infrastructure that you need to put in place for something like generative AI versus something else like predictive analytics or real-time data analysis can be very different, right? It could depend on your model size, how many data sets you have, how many users that you're going to want to support with all those kinds of things. So it is still early, and I think you had mentioned this in some of your comments. So I think today we're in an early stage of that, but I think over time, just like we've seen through storage, over time, right, we're going to evolve and improve it and make it more efficient over time. Now, around how much data and storage we ultimately need, again, a lot of our research suggests that, we are going to need bigger data set size. But how much data do we ultimately, need to store, is still something that's going to evolve as well. Clearly, when we're doing these chat bots and some of these other kinds of things, it can generate, a reasonable amount of data. But we may not need to store that for, months, years, or whatever. But other aspects we certainly may. And I think that as we start to see AI proliferate a little bit more, we're going to see that evolution continue to take place. And I think that's where it's going to start to have some bigger implications around storage.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's funny, again, I mentioned AI isn't one thing, and you of course echo that. I think it's no more clear, like in the example of small to large. You guys may be familiar with NVIDIA putting out the Chat with RTX software, which is super cool in that it's a really simple package. It's a big payload capacity wise, but you download it, install it. It even works on some laptops that have the appropriate RTX card. But we ran it on a NAS. We put a little GPU, an A4000 in a NAS, and set up a private chatbot using, I think it's the Llama 7 billion or 13 billion model. And then there's another one in there as well. And as I think about, is my storage good enough for AI? In something like that, the storage isn't much of anything at all. It's hard drive storage. It's not high speed. But now with a little GPU and a NAS, you can direct this chatbot, private and free, against the data on the NAS. So you have all the locality there and get a lot of insights. And to your point, the storage on the back end in terms of what this thing is outputting isn't really the biggest concern. It's your source data that in this case on the NAS may be your primary data also, but it brings up this whole other notion of at scale. I mean, it works, that's in a NAS, but if I go put a $350,000 8-way H100 box in my organization, then how do I present my data lakes to it? And do I need a caching storage server with drives? And do I care about data protection for that system? I mean, there's so much there that, again, I just want to keep hammering this point that there is not an AI and there's not a storage solution for AI. There's a whole spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and just to touch on the other polling question, I guess, are you using or planning to deploy an AI ML platform? It's kind of a three-way split between companies that are using them now, companies that have no plans to, and then the remaining third has plans within the next 6 months to 2 years. So it's definitely quite a mix right now. But I mean, ultimately, it does look like most of the companies will deploy AI ML in some way, shape, or form, and storage is definitely going to be a big part of that investment.
Hey, Cam, we've got a question about the future of our hard drives in this scenario, and I think this is an interesting one and a fair question. With hard drive capacities up over 30 terabytes now, with HAMR, the capacity per dollar metric still makes a lot of sense for hard drives in these super big data lakes, and there's a lot of hardware out there that can harness these drives and make them really quite performant, or performant enough for a lot of AI use cases. But that's where I was just mentioning, if all the data is on hard drives, and I believe that there's still a very strong market for hard drives generally, for storing these giant data sets that nobody wants to delete, because now with new AI models, I can mine that data and get insights. But there may be some other ways where we see hard drives fronted with an SSD cache that's either Ethernet attached, or in some way high speed connected to the GPU server to get GPU direct storage adjacent to those GPUs so that they can make insights faster. That may not be required, though. There are plenty of models out there where an inferencing job might need to take place, and that can be fully supplied by hard drives that are plenty fast enough, given the right networking infrastructure, to be able to fill those GPUs and handle that task, where capacity is really important. That may be, several petabytes of data that these GPUs are churning through. So I do think there is a place for hard drives. Will it be the number one spot for high-speed training? Probably not. But like the NAS example with chat with the RTX, or yes, that runs just fine against hard drives. So again, a continuum.
Yeah, thanks for the comments and addressing that question about hard drives. Getting into kind of maybe the higher level storage and potentially hard drive topic. Okay, so SAS is an aging technology, and then of course people are wondering, is SAS dead? And what is the role of SAS in the future of storage? Given that this is a SCSI trade association, which promotes the use of SAS technology, of course, my answer is going to be no. SAS is not dead, and there's a little bit. I'll share a little bit of information here soon. But let me kick it over to Jeff to comment a little bit about storage shipments by technology.
Yeah, and Cam, you're right. I mean, the answer is obviously no. SAS is not dead, and I think as Brian mentioned, hard drives are certainly a technology that we think does have a relatively long lifespan here, and I think as you can see in this chart, right, where we're looking at capacity optimized, or some folks call these sort of the nearline types of drives. You can see that still represents the vast majority of storage capacity that's shipping in the overall market. And that's really all behind a SAS controller, right? And, while we do see Flash making some inroads for some of those performance applications, it doesn't mean that hard drives aren't going to be an important part of the overall ecosystem. And I think, Brian made some, interesting comments, because you're right. I mean, hard drives do continue to be the low cost, at least from $1 per gig basis, storage solution out there. And we think that there's obviously a very large installed base that still needs to be refreshed to some lower cost types of drives. And even when we look at hard drives, right, there's a roadmap for some future technologies. And I know Seagate's come out and talked about HAMR and some of those kinds of things. And today, hard drives are still, just above about a penny a gigabyte, which we think is a very attractive solution for a lot of folks. And it's something, at least from a SAS perspective, right, really gives, I think, this chart, a lot of validity just in terms of where we are today, but also over the next several years.
Yeah. So Jeff, just for clarification, that blue section is capacity optimized hard drives that are sitting behind mostly a SAS infrastructure.
Absolutely. Yep. And you can see, I know, we do talk a lot about, Flash and SSDs and the like, but, when you look at where the bits reside, you're absolutely right. It all sits behind a SAS infrastructure.
Yeah. And the enterprise SSD, which is probably mostly NVMe, but there is still some SAS SSD that's likely part of that enterprise SSD mix.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, NVMe certainly made a lot of inroads over the last, 5 years or so. But there are a lot of markets where, SAS SSDs are still the mainstay. We see a lot of SAS still being used in the storage array market. So very popular in, all flash arrays, but also hybrid arrays tends to be very popular. Even in a lot of your general purpose server SAS SSDs can be a great solution there as well.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. And, just to, just give people a level set, SAS technology is not, is not just the command set, but it is also a transport. So it's everything. Where NVM Express itself is a command set that sits on top of a PCIe transport. So SAS is the ecosystem is a little bit different. But the ecosystem includes companies that make SAS expanders, RAID controllers, SAS HBAs, hard drives, SSDs, cables, connectors, and that's all around SAS technology. Just a quick look here at the SAS technology roadmap. 24 gig SAS has been out in the industry for a number of years now. And you can see that, we're not going to 48. We're going to go to 24 gig plus. And the reason behind that is we're finding that customers prefer to have refinements in the feature and capabilities of 24 gig SAS, but not necessarily go to another speed jump, at least for SSDs. So 24 gig SAS is mostly defined, and we're going to have a plug fest coming next month to do some testing of 24 gig SAS and 24 gig plus. But the roadmap will continue, and there'll be kind of more incremental refinements within the 24 gig SAS speed bump. And just to do the last touch on why is SAS basically so widely used, and it just works. It's been proven, it's mature. We call these the value pillars of SAS, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but all these items here are what basically made SAS technology an industry standard, and why it still continued to be used and purchased and deployed today, and probably for the next good number of years. So let's go to the next polling question. We're going to move on to SSD form factors here. So the first question is, have you deployed or are you considering deploying EDSFF E1 or E3 form factor drives? Hopefully folks are aware of that, the new form factor that has been launched by some number of device companies such as mine, as well as OEMs of servers and storage and hyperscale platforms.
Hey, Cam, while those votes are coming in, there's a number of questions about the future of hard drives, and I think we've addressed some of that. I don't believe, and I think Jeff's chart echoes, that hard drives are in any particular hurry to depart the market. Despite high capacity flash being out there, we've got a bunch of 61 terabyte drives, for instance, in the lab. The cost per terabyte for hard drives is still very much in the platter's favor, and not all jobs need to be done on flash. There was another question about flash for backup. We are seeing a lot of flash being used in backup, not necessarily to make your backups faster, but for something like instant restores or Veeam Instant Recovery, for instance, to be able to run those on robust infrastructure is interesting. And also from the AI perspective, since we were talking about that before, to be able to run AI jobs against backup data that doesn't hit production or doesn't require a big batch of copy data to be stood up so that we now have a third or fourth or fifth copy of data is an interesting use case, very much in the minority, but something we're seeing a little bit more of. So just a couple thoughts on some of those questions. And one last one was around LTO tape. I love tape. We're seeing object deployed on tape. Quantum's doing this. A lot of clouds are doing this, despite how they may market it. But tape is still very much a thing. And I know that's a little bit outside of the scope of today's conversation, but it is storage. And I think when you look at some of these big libraries, Diamondback from IBM, for instance, Spectralogic has got several. Again, both of those were very popular booths and technologies at Supercompute last year. The HPC installments are using tape, and I would argue that probably a massive chunk of the Fortune 500 are as well.
Yeah, thanks for the commentary, Brian. The second part of the polling question around E1 and E3 is, if you are deploying EDSFF, which one are you deploying, E1, E3? Hopefully we have an option for both. I don't know if we have the ability to check both, but we're definitely interested in seeing the adoption of EDSFF as it hits the market. Certainly has started in E1 with, we'll give it to Brian here. You know what? Let me just hand it off to Brian.
These guys, the EDSFF form factors are so cool because they all have the same drive connector. I don't know how well this shows up on camera, but all the same connector, which makes design a little bit more interesting. These are the E1S, of course, the short guys. The main difference, the board inside is the same spec. I think, what is that, Cam? A 9 mil or 9.5 on
9.5.
9.5 on the board. But in what can be confusing when you look at these form factors, the E1S spec comes in a variety of Z heights, ranging from a bare drive that's 9.5 mil up to this guy, an OCP spec, which is 25 mil. OCP wants to run their data centers warmer, and so they have these giant heat sinks to help dissipate data. But we've even got form factor challenges, opportunities, perhaps, depending on the way you see the world. With E3, there's an E3S, which is a very skinny version, and then this E3 2T, which is a 15 mil version of the drives. Fundamentally, organizations aren't going to get a choice. If you're buying mainstream servers, you're going to be forced to go to E3S probably for most Gen 5 deployments, certainly Gen 6 and beyond. I don't get the sense that the SSD vendors want to continue to make a dozen different form factors for every single drive that they try to produce. It's somewhat unsustainable. And the server guys, Dell, for instance, only supports Gen 5 with E3S drives, and that's not uncommon when you look at the big infrastructure in server vendors. So I think the U.2, U.3, we're kind of at the end of it here. There'll be some Gen 5 options available in those drives, but going forward, that's going to have to change. So the enterprise is really going with the E3S form factor, the skinny one, where the E1S guys are being a little more prevalent in hyperscale, but we do still see, we've had the Supermicro 24 bay E1S server in, Gigabyte makes one. There are other platforms out there that take advantage of them, just a little less common in the enterprise.
So you're seeing a lot more variants in E3 and E1 in addition to M.2s and 2.5?
Yeah, arguably, again, too many, but I guess that's how this works, right? The specs get out there, and we'll define 5 different E1S shapes and sizes, and however the industry goes, it goes. Thankfully, in that case, it's just a heatsink design and not a real big change in the way the drive is produced or anything of that nature. But I do think that the push into these new form factors in Gen 5 creates a tremendous amount of opportunity for organizations to take advantage of these speeds and capabilities. There's also a good deal of confusion in the industry about what do I need to buy, what's the difference between these drives. And then there's even a much more modern problem is, how do I aggregate these drives and do something with them? There are very few, nary any RAID cards that can really traditional RAID cards that can really let your drives go at full speed. We've been playing with several other solutions that'll let you get that performance. We've got plenty of reviews on Grade, for instance, that does this. But it does drive home the point that the faster these components get, especially around storage, it creates a whole new need for awareness and solutions from software and hardware standpoint to aggregate these drives and provide some layer of data protection if you want that. But not everyone does. Not every application needs it. But software, traditional MD-ADM isn't going to get it done. Lots to consider there.
So just one more question, quick question for Brian, then I'll turn it over to Jeff. I do understand that some server and storage OEMs want to make PCIe 5.0 kind of a transition point to migrate to at least E3. So given that, I mean, are you seeing higher performance and higher density solutions in EDSFF as opposed to U.2?
That's a great question. As you know intimately well, the leap from Gen 3 to 4 and 4 to 5 is not a single step. Hey, we put a new controller on and we're done. Enjoy this for the next 3 years. It's far from that easy. And I think we saw this in the move from 3 to 4. Is the first Gen 4 drives were really great compared to Gen 3, but not nearly as good as the last Gen 4 drives were. And I think we've seen some of that transition again to Gen 5. The performance, no doubt. I mean, when you're talking about 14,000 megabytes a second read out of a single drive, which is essentially your top end performance opportunity with Gen 5 compared to 6,500 or 7,000 in Gen 4, it's a tremendous difference. Still a lot of challenges though, and I would suggest that as you're doing POCs and evals of storage, you can't just buy a Gen 5 drive and assume that it's the same as all the other drives. This is true very clearly in the client space, but also the same in the enterprise. There's a wide disparity in drives and what their targeted use cases are. Again, I think it just comes back to really understanding your workload and then understanding which infrastructure bits you need. Storage is a big one, of course, that we're talking about today. But like I said before, network, CPU. Do I need 128 core CPUs? Maybe, but maybe not. And there's so many different considerations right now. You said one other thing about density. The one challenge I'm seeing with these really skinny EDSFF form factors is that many of them are single board. So before, where a U.2, you have two boards that you can fold over and string together. The capacity points there are obviously roughly twice of what you can get in most, except for some of these thicker drives.
Yeah.
So I think we'll take a brief step back in overall drive capacity, from the 6144s that are shipping now with QLC down to 30.72. But we'll see where that goes.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. And Jeff, what are you seeing as far as, I guess, form factor evolutions, as far as, unit shipments?
Yeah, and I think as Brian mentioned, right, I mean, we are, seeing a lot of different variation out here, and right, having those examples of some of those different drives is really powerful. We are at a bit of an inflection point, and I think as Brian noted, it does depend a little bit on your workload, depends on your infrastructure, what you're trying to accomplish. But I kind of go back to some of the comments we made a little bit earlier when we talked about AI, and that how we're initially are using today's existing ecosystem and infrastructure to develop today's AI. And that was much like Flash, right? It initially came on, there were some benefits to it. But now over time, we've started to evolve Flash, particularly in the way of form factors, right? To make it more dense, to maybe get some more performance or to deal with some of those thermal configurations that people want to do. And again, when we look in the rearview mirror, right, it was very much, the traditional way of doing it, right? And in some ways, that was really driven by, the existing ecosystem, which was really built around 2.5-inch U.2 types of applications. But as you can see, when we start to move forward, we do see a bit of a diversity out there, right? And as people go about trying to optimize their infrastructure for whatever they're trying to do, right? I think there's going to be the tools in the toolbox, at least from a form factor perspective, that folks are going to be able to accomplish a lot more things. So I think this is just, one more step, at least in terms of Flash, in terms of really trying to optimize some of your infrastructure to take advantage of some of those inherent benefits that Flash can do, which is, a flexible form factor and deliver some of the density, in terms of, the capacity per drive in a small footprint that maybe wasn't available in some of these other form factors.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the update on that, Jeff. Just to touch on the two poll questions that we had. The first question was, have you deployed or considering deploying EDSFF E1 or E3 form factor drives? And interestingly, there's a kind of an even split between yes, we're already doing so, around 23%. 23% said no, but planning to in the next 6 months. 26% said not yet, but in the next 1 to 2 years. And then the remaining quarter says no, we don't plan to do so. The last question was, if you are deploying, are you deploying E1 or E3? And that was a very even split down the middle at 50-50. So interesting. It seems like there's a good swath of I guess answers here. So we're at about 45 past the hour. I think we want to move into kind of a Q&A mode right now.
Oh, Cam, let me start. There's one I'm passionate about at the top.
Okay.
So we're talking all this about hard drives and flash and all these technologies and form factors. And one thing I think is really fun is the conversation around hard drives and whether or not NVMe hard drives are going to be a thing. I mean, clearly, yeah, Jeff's chart for NVMe hard drive penetration in the market was, I don't think it had them on the line, but it's definitely something that shows it up at OCP. And every time I go to the storage sessions there, I love seeing the NVMe hard drives. Seagate has shown them off before. We've written about it a couple times. Not really a thing yet, but certainly interesting and fun to think about, like with EDSFF, where we're unifying on a connector. Kind of fun to think about a universal connector for drives. But I just saw that one and wanted to bring it up because NVMe hard drives do make me a bit giddy.
Jeff, do you have any thoughts on what you're seeing around NVMe based hard drives?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some interest, and I think Seagate's come out and talked a little bit about that, or made some conversations around the possibility of it, and when you really step back, it is an interface change, but one of the reasons maybe that it's a little slow to adopt, right, is if you go back to that chart that I shared about really the amount of capacity and the amount of infrastructure that's currently in place, that's really SaaS leveraged. It's hard to displace that. And while there obviously are maybe some benefits in terms of trying to unify around NVMe over the long term, there you could get some TCO benefits. I think, Cam, you touched on, right, some of that value proposition around SaaS, right? As you can see, right, there's a very large installed base that continue to see some value in that. So over time, I think Brian's right. I mean, is it interesting? Is it exciting? Yeah, absolutely, right. To see how some of these technologies may continue to evolve, and as flash does continue to become a bigger percentage of the overall ecosystem, right, I think it may help to further that along, but just the same, right, I mean, there's obviously a lot of ecosystem that's still built around SaaS. Okay.
Thanks, Jeff. There is a question for you. What is any projections on the split between public cloud and on-prem AI storage?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I mean, we have done some work. We haven't published anything quite yet around that. Obviously, I think this initial wave around AI that we're seeing is really being driven in a lot of ways by a lot of the public cloud vendors. But I know a lot of the survey work that we've done, right, seems to suggest that the way this will ultimately start to play out a little bit is a lot of folks will then look to customize or build upon some of those publicly available models that are out there. And those are likely to move back on-prem potentially for either security reasons or compliance reasons, or just that people want to have that data in-house. So, again, when we say AI, it doesn't just mean everything's going to the cloud. I think as we see this AI evolution, right? I mean, there's going to be a place for it in the cloud. There'll be a place for it on-prem. There's going to be a place at the edge as well, where, the edge is obviously where we're going to be collecting a lot of this data. But also when we start to think about inferencing and doing these types of things, that's going to be done better at the edge, let alone, even when we start to think about like client devices like the PC and what have you, where, AI and Microsoft certainly have a push to, integrate, a lot of those AI features directly in your device. And then soon we'll see it in mobile as well. So I think that idea of AI everywhere is going to proliferate, and I don't see any, difference between saying, hey, yeah, there's definitely going to be a strong AI presence in on-prem data centers as well.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that question and answer. Actually, Brian, there's an interesting one here about something called cyber storage as a trend, and it's a new feature of storage or an entirely new product category. I'm not terribly familiar with cyber storage, but wanted to see if either of you are familiar with it.
I like that. You weren't sure about it, so you gave it to me. I'm also unsure about that term specifically. I presume the question has a security element to it, or a maybe a ransomware protection story or something. I mean, those are all obviously very important issues. I know, Cam, you're pretty intimate with some of the security features specifically on SSDs that are coming to market, but no, it's not one I'm terribly familiar with that term.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Here's one. Maybe. Well, we'll just whoever has any thoughts on this. Is storage demands or the storage demands trend mainly affected by hyperscalers? If yes, what do you expect it in enterprise on-premise infrastructure?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll tackle that a little bit, right? I mean, so the demand from the hyperscalers continues to be very, very large, right? And it does represent a vast majority, and even of the chart that I shared with you earlier around capacity optimized, a lot of that is ending up with the hyperscalers. But it clearly doesn't mean that on-prem data centers are going away by any fashion, right? People tend to leverage it, either for security, compliance, just legacy reasons, right? So on-premise, doesn't necessarily, sort of go away, at least from that perspective. So, we really see, both, continuing to coexist and continuing to have value really for different customers of different needs.
No, I would echo that and also add that we are seeing something that's kind of interesting, especially from the SSD development process, where again, I think, and I don't want to speak for Cam and Kioxia, but just generally speaking, we see a strong desire by the SSD guys to not have to make so many variants of their drives. And one of those is it seems like there's more energy now than ever to make a drive that goes to the hyperscalers, who typically buy in volume, as Jeff's saying, and sort of dictate what gets made for the enterprise just as a drag along. But we are seeing more interest in having nearly one SKU or maybe a SKU with a different firmware for hyperscalers and enterprise. And if we get there, that efficiency should be good for the overall market in terms of enabling SSD vendors to produce a couple million of one product and then perhaps tune it a little bit for an enterprise use versus hyperscaler use. But some potential efficiencies coming, I think.
Okay, we're starting to get close to the top of the hour, but actually there's one question I wanted to touch on here about EDSFF form factors. I think I know the guy asking the question. There are so many form factors as part of EDSFF. How can we really call it a standard when it seems like there are 10 to choose from, plus possibly more to come? How are the drive suppliers going to focus efforts on commonality with so many choices? There's a little bit more, but Yeah, a standard, wants to be able to accommodate all the use cases as possible. But as you'd probably notice, being I guess involved in somewhat standards development, there are a lot of things that get defined, and a lot of things end up being optional, with just a handful of things becoming kind of required, and then a couple of more things become more of a de facto standard. But then you have a number of optional outliers that are options for companies to develop around for more specific use cases. I think initially what we're seeing is, the E1.S and E3.S are probably going to be the most prevalent form factor versions, with maybe E1.L and E3.S2T as maybe the next more common ones. But there are a lot of variants that are defined just so companies can have options for specific use cases. Let's see. Let's see if we have time for one more question. Well, I mean, I think we should probably cut it right here, because we have to read through the questions. And I think what might be best is that we'll just address any open questions in a Q&A blog that'll be posted and issued by the STA Forum through SNIA, hopefully within the next week or so. So any closing comments, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've hit on so many things here, and it's pretty wild to think about storage. I mean, it's always been important, but as an enabler of all these new technologies and locations, we didn't talk a ton about the edge, but certainly a big opportunity there. I'm really excited about it. We're thrilled to be able to participate in the conversation around all these different technologies. And again, if you want to get in touch with us and you love storage conversation, we've got an open Discord at Storage Review, and you can find us on social at Storage Review, pretty much everywhere. So check us out. We appreciate the support.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Any closing comments, Jeff? I think you're muted.
No, I think as we kind of started the conversation, Cam, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about how the last year or so has been a somewhat of a challenging year for the storage industry, but moving forward, right? I mean, a lot of the things that we talked about around data creation, the value of data, some of these new AI, new form factors and the like, right, are only going to, help to kind of continue to, increase the value of storage. So I think it's going to be an exciting time. We see, better growth here as we kind of work our way through 2024. And I think that that's only going to help to continue to kind of showcase really where storage is in terms of the overall infrastructure.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. And as we wrap things up, I'd like to thank both Jeff and Brian for joining us this year on the storage trends. And last but not least, if you like the storage trend webcast here, please feel free to rate it and follow us on the social media, I guess X, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And I guess hopefully we'll do this again next year. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.